My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old and my brother ignored my existence for 12 years until he needed someone to ruin. At our Christmas dinner, he called my life's work worthless and demanded I co-sign a loan to save his failing freight business. When I refused, my parents threatened to banish me from the family forever. I took a calm sip of my red wine and told them exactly how much my worthless business had just sold for. The silence was deafening. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago meant that appearances were everything to my parents. Inside our home, perfection was expected and failure was punished with freezing silence. That coldness permeated the dining room this Christmas. The table was laden with turkey glasses and platters, but the air was suffocating. I sat quietly at the end of the table wearing a simple dress contrasting with my mother's silk blouse and my brother Preston's suit. Preston sat to my right, swirling his bourbon, radiating an arrogant entitlement that my parents had nurtured since he was a boy. Across from him sat his wife, Simone. She was an African-American woman, a financial auditor, who always seemed to observe our family dysfunction with sharp, calculating eyes. She remained still, her hands resting lightly on the tablecloth, silently watching the impending storm gather. Without warning, Preston reached into his briefcase beside his chair. He pulled out a stack of legal documents and tossed them across the table. They landed on top of my dinner plate, knocking my fork aside. I looked at the loan guarantee document. The ink was fresh and my name was typed at the bottom next to a signature line. "Sign it," Preston demanded, not looking me in the eye as he cut into his meat. "My freight contracts are going under. Your app has zero collateral, but your credit score is pristine. I need $500,000 by Tuesday to keep the shipping fleet afloat." I stared at the stack of papers, my heart pounding a familiar rhythm of anxiety. "You want me to take on $500,000 of debt for your failing business?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. My father slammed his fist onto the heavy oak table, making the wine glasses rattle. "You will do your duty to this family, Cassidy," he barked. "Your brother is running a real company, a true legacy. He is operating heavy machinery, managing logistics, doing the hard work I trained him to do. What are you doing? Typing code into a laptop in a cramped apartment." I looked at my father, feeling old wounds tear open. "You paid for his full ride through his MBA program," I reminded him softly. "You refused to give me a dime for community college. I worked 3 jobs just to buy the laptop you are mocking." My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Because Preston is the future of our family name. You have spent the last 12 years playing around with some silly application, refusing to join the real world. If you do not sign that paper and support your brother, you can pack your coat and leave. Do not bother calling us tomorrow. Do not bother coming to Thanksgiving. You will be banished tonight." The threat hung heavy in the air of the dining room. Banished. Cut off. Tossed aside for refusing to be a sacrificial lamb for their golden child. Simone took a slow sip of her drink, her dark eyes darting from my father to me. She was an auditor, and I could tell she knew Preston's freight business was bleeding cash. She knew this $500,000 was just a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. I looked at Preston. His smug smile made my stomach turn. He believed he had me cornered. He believed the threat of losing my family would force my hand, just like it had when they forced me to hand over my teenage savings to pay for his mistakes. I reached out and placed my fingers on the loan document. Slowly, deliberately, I slid the paper off my plate and pushed it back across the mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Preston's bourbon glass. "I cannot co-sign," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "I signed a different contract yesterday. I sold my company." Preston let out a laugh that bounced off the dining room walls. "You sold your company? Your worthless little app business. What did you get for it?" "50 grand. Just enough to pay off your cheap car." My father shook his head in disgust, muttering about my lack of ambition. My mother rolled her eyes, already preparing to yell at me again for deflecting the conversation. I picked up my wine glass, taking a slow, measured sip of the red wine. I looked into Preston's eyes, watching his arrogant smirk hold steady. $190 million, I said softly. Cash and stock options. The air was sucked out of the room. Preston's jaw dropped, his laughter dying in his throat. The glass in my father's hand froze. My mother stopped breathing. The shock paralyzed them all, shattering the 12 years of insults they had thrown at me. Simone raised one eyebrow, a faint, impressed smile playing on her lips. The silence was profound, heavy with the sudden shift in power. The mockery vanished from my mother's face. She leaned forward, her expression suddenly transforming into a terrifyingly sweet, greedy smile. "Well, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with honey. "Since you have so much money now, $10 million is the perfect amount to save your brother's legacy. It is the least you owe us." I looked at my father, my eyes cold and steady, even as his face darkened with a vein-popping rage that made the crystal ornaments on the nearby shelf tremble. "You want to talk about duty, Dad? You want to talk about how this family operates? You expect me to just hand over $500,000 to clean up a mess that Preston created? I will not do it. I have worked for every single dollar in my accounts while Preston has spent his entire adult life gambling away the money you practically throw at him." My mother let out a shrill gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if I had physically struck her. "How can you be so cruel at Christmas?" She shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. "Your brother is in trouble, and instead of helping him, you sit there and lecture us about finances. You were always the difficult one, Cassidy. Always the one who had to make things about yourself." I looked at my mother, noting the way she avoided my gaze, focusing instead on her wine glass. "I wasn't making it about me, Mom. I was stating the reality of my life. I haven't asked this family for a favor in 7 years. Not when I was struggling to pay rent in San Francisco, not when my first company nearly went under, and certainly not when I was sleeping in my office just to hit my coding deadlines. I have managed just fine on my own." Preston stood up so quickly that his chair screeched against the hardwood, and he marched toward me. He reached out his fingers, digging into my shoulder, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. "You are going to sign those papers, Cassidy. You are going to sign them right now, or you are never going to step foot in this house again. Do you understand me? You are dead to us." I didn't flinch. I felt a surge of cold, clarifying power as I looked at the man who had tormented me through childhood. I didn't push him, but I stood my ground, my posture relaxed and defiant. "You already made me dead to you years ago, Preston. The only reason I am here tonight is because I wanted to see if there was any humanity left in this room. I see now that I was mistaken." My mother rushed over to us, her face contorted with a mixture of panic and performative anger. She reached out her fingers, clawing at the straps of my purse. "You are being ridiculous. If you have that much money, you don't need it all. Let me see your bank app. Let me see how much you really have. I am sure you are just hiding it from us." I pulled my purse away, stepping back firmly. "Do not touch my things. I am leaving." I turned toward the hallway, my heart racing with the thrill of finally cutting the last cord that tied me to their toxic control. But Preston stepped squarely in front of the door, his eyes wild. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his leverage was gone and that his only path to salvation was through me. "You think you are so smart, don't you?" He hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "You think you can walk away with all that money while the family business burns? I bought you that laptop 8 years ago. That $500 piece of junk is the reason you have a career. I have a contract in my safe signed by you stating that I own 20% of your company." I stared at him, my mouth turning upward into a mocking smile. "A contract? You mean the piece of paper you probably drafted on your lunch break?" He blinked, taken aback by my lack of fear. "It is a legal document," he growled. "You signed it when you were 25. I am taking my share. $38 million is coming into my bank account by Monday, or I am taking this to the police and claiming you stole my intellectual property." I smoothed my coat, realizing that the game was no longer about them trying to control me. It was about them trying to survive their own incompetence. I didn't care about their anger. I didn't care about their threats. I had been preparing for this day for 3 years. I adjusted my scarf and looked at my family, my parents who had always viewed me as a liability, my brother who saw me as an ATM, and Simone who was still silently watching, her eyes never leaving my face. She looked bored, almost as if she were waiting for this specific moment of humiliation to unfold. "Keep the 38 million, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the house like a blade. "But you should probably check your email before you call the police. I filed a report with the firm's legal team about your little forgery scheme an hour ago. And as for the company, feel free to try to claim your 20%. I have already contacted the tech giant's legal department. They love litigating against people who commit securities fraud." I turned toward the door, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. Preston was still standing in the doorway, his face pale and slack-jawed, the reality of my calm response finally beginning to hit him. He reached out as if to grab my arm again, but I was already past him, walking through the foyer and toward the cold night air, finally free from their expectations, their threats, and their hollow family bond. 1 week after walking out of that suffocating dining room, I stood in the showroom of a Porsche dealership in Chicago. The midnight blue Panamera on the polished tile floor represented a lifetime of deferred dreams and validation of my hard work. The salesman Julian had been fawning. He handed me sparkling water and bowed as he took my black American Express card to process it. I had earned this exact moment. 8 years of building logistics algorithms, skipping meals, and sleeping under my desk had culminated in a celebration I could taste. I waited, expecting Julian to return with the keys. Instead, he approached with a tight, uncomfortable smile. He held my card out delicately as if it had caught fire. "I am so sorry, Miss Cassidy," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your card has been declined." I asked if there was a spending limit issue, knowing my account held enough liquid capital to buy the dealership. Julian shook his head. He told me the terminal indicated a hard block placed by my financial institution. The humiliation was immediate, a hot flush rising to my cheeks as other customers glanced our way. I snatched the card from his hand, excused myself, and stepped outside into the biting winter wind. I dialed my private wealth manager, demanding an explanation. The representative placed me on hold, the elevator music mocking my rising panic. When he returned, his tone was devoid of its usual warmth. He informed me a civil court injunction had been placed on my accounts 2 hours ago. My assets were locked. All $190 million from my company sale were frozen pending active litigation. The bank had to comply with the court order. I ended the call, the freezing Chicago air feeling suffocating. Preston had actually done it. My arrogant brother filed a lawsuit to hold my wealth hostage. I dialed David, my mergers and acquisitions attorney. He answered on the first ring, furious typing echoing in the background. He was already reviewing the emergency court filings. David explained the nightmare Preston had orchestrated. My brother filed an aggressive civil suit demanding $38 million, claiming breach of contract and requesting an immediate freeze on all my liquid assets. I paced down the icy sidewalk, my grip on the phone tightening. I asked David how a judge could freeze my net worth over an unsubstantiated claim. David let out a heavy sigh. "It is not unsubstantiated in the eyes of the court," David explained grimly. Preston did not file a lawsuit based solely on his word. He provided sworn affidavits from 2 eyewitnesses corroborating his claim. I stopped walking. The city traffic faded into a dull roar. Who I demanded, though a sickening knot forming in my stomach already knew the answer. David read from the legal filing. "William and Catherine, my own parents. They signed sworn legal statements under penalty of perjury. They claimed they were sitting at a table with Preston and me 8 years ago. They described in fabricated detail watching me cry and beg Preston to buy me a $500 laptop because I could not afford one. Furthermore, they swore under oath that they physically watched me sign a makeshift contract on a coffee shop napkin, promising Preston 20% of any future tech company I built in exchange for the hardware. They were committing outright perjury to steal my wealth and save my brother's sinking freight business." David's voice grew urgent as he laid out Preston's strategy. This was a classic legal bleed-out. Family disputes over early-stage startup equity could drag on in civil court for years. Preston knew he did not have a legitimate claim, but he knew tying up hundreds of millions of dollars in legal red tape would force me to negotiate. He was betting I would hand over the $38 million just to make the lawsuit go away and regain access to my funds. David warned me fighting this could take a massive toll both financially and emotionally, especially with my parents willing to lie on the stand to destroy me. They were using the legal system as an instrument of extortion. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. My parents were willing to risk federal perjury charges just to ensure their golden child did not face the consequences of running his own company into the ground. I refused to let them win. I told David I would not settle for a single penny and demanded to see the supposed evidence they had filed. David immediately emailed me the scanned exhibit from the court docket. I opened the file on my phone. It was a high-resolution scan of a stained paper napkin. There, scrawled in blue ink, was a crude agreement promising a 20% equity stake to Preston, complete with my forged signature. My blood ran cold. The forgery was surprisingly good, mimicking the slight leftward slant of my handwriting from my college days. For a terrifying second, panic threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. But then my eyes drifted upward. I stopped staring at the forged signature and looked closely at the top left corner of the napkin. I zoomed in on the image, the pixels sharpening into absolute clarity. A slow, dark smirk spread across my face, replacing the panic. The napkin featured a custom-printed logo called the Roasting Bean. I knew that coffee shop well. I spent hundreds of hours coding my initial software there. Because I spent so much time there, I knew a critical fact about their branding. The logo printed on this so-called 8-year-old napkin was a minimalist geometric design. The Roasting Bean had not rebranded to this specific logo until 2 years ago. This contract had not been signed 8 years ago. It was a fresh forgery, and they had just handed me the weapon to destroy them. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of David's downtown law firm, the adrenaline still rushing through my veins. The receptionist recognized me immediately and nodded toward the corner office. I did not bother knocking. David was already standing by his floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a thick manila folder resting on his glass desk. The sleek, cold corporate environment usually felt intimidating to most clients, but today it was exactly the kind of war room I needed. David turned around, his expression grave. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He gestured to the folder which contained the official civil complaint Preston had filed. David explained the brutal reality of the situation. Preston was not just suing for $38 million. He had filed an emergency injunction to freeze the entirety of my acquisition payout. His strategy was obvious and entirely malicious. By locking up the $190 million, Preston intended to bleed me dry. He knew I would have to pay astronomical legal fees out of my remaining personal savings, which were rapidly dwindling. David walked over to the desk and leaned heavily against it. He warned me that family disputes over early-stage equity are incredibly messy. Civil courts treat these napkin agreements seriously when sworn affidavits from family members are attached. Preston filed motions demanding full forensic accounting of my company from the day of its inception. David explained that Preston and his legal team would drag this out for years in the court system, filing endless discovery requests until I was financially exhausted. They were banking on my breaking point. David looked me directly in the eye and suggested what any pragmatic attorney would. He told me that settling for $5 or $10 million might be the fastest way to lift the injunction and get my life back. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk and let out a sharp, humorless laugh. I told David I would rather burn the money in a barrel on Lower Wacker Drive than give my brother a single cent. David sighed, reminding me that we were fighting against 3 adults willing to lie under oath. He asked how I planned to fight a coordinated familial front without going bankrupt in the process. I leaned forward, planting my elbows on the glass desk. I told David that my brother was not a criminal mastermind. He was a desperate, sloppy coward who had been bailed out of every mistake he ever made. I explained that this was not the first time Preston had committed fraud to save his own skin. When Preston was 24, he racked up $50,000 in underground sports betting debts. To pay off the bookies, he stole the checkbook for my father's freight company. Preston meticulously forged our father's signature on 3 separate corporate checks. David listened intently as I detailed the fallout. When the company accountant caught the discrepancies, my father did not call the police. Instead, William fired the loyal accountant to keep the secret buried. My father went to the bank, claimed there had been an administrative error, and personally absorbed the loss by pulling equity out of our family home. William protected his golden child from federal fraud charges, and in doing so, taught Preston that forgery was a perfectly acceptable tool for survival. I looked at David, making sure he understood the gravity of my words. I told him my parents were not just covering for Preston today. They had been acting as his accomplices for over a decade. David paced across the room, processing the history of my family's corruption. He pointed out that past bad behavior did not automatically invalidate the sworn affidavits my parents had just submitted to the judge. The court only cared about the evidence directly tied to my company. Preston had presented a physical contract, and my parents had sworn they watched me sign it. David warned me that unless we could definitively prove the document was a fake, the judge would keep the injunction in place until a trial, which could be 3 years away. I reached into my bag and pulled out the high-resolution printout of the scanned napkin exhibit that David had emailed me earlier. I stood up and laid it flat on the center of his desk, smoothing out the edges. I told David that Preston was so arrogant he forgot that details matter. I pointed to the logo printed faintly in the top left corner of the napkin. David leaned in, squinting at the paper. He asked what I was looking at. I explained that the coffee shop, The Roasting Bean, was my sanctuary when I first started coding my logistics platform 8 years ago. I knew that place inside and out. I told David to look closely at the logo. It was a minimalist geometric outline of a coffee cup with a single wisp of steam. I pulled out my phone and opened a digital archive of local business records. I showed David the original branding for the roasting bean from 8 years ago. It was a completely different design, a rustic vintage-looking stamp featuring a coffee bean sack and ornate lettering. The minimalist logo on the napkin in his evidence file did not exist back then. I looked at David, my voice dropping to a hard, decisive tone. I explained that the roasting bean did not undergo their corporate rebrand until 2 years ago. They completely overhauled their interior, their cups and their napkins to match this aesthetic. I tapped my index finger firmly against the geometric logo on the printout, ensuring he understood the magnitude of this discovery. David, I said, maintaining absolute eye contact. This napkin is from a local coffee shop called The Roasting Bean. But they did not rebrand to this specific minimalist logo until 2 years ago. This was not signed 8 years ago. It is a fresh forgery. 3 weeks later, the sterile chill of the downtown deposition room matched the ice in my veins. I sat beside David at a long mahogany table, a court reporter tapping away rhythmically in the corner. Across from us sat my mother Catherine and my brother Preston. Next to Preston sat his wife Simone, wearing a sharp gray suit and an expression of complete indifference. Preston looked incredibly smug, leaning back in his leather chair, as if he had already won. He was wearing a custom suit, likely bought on credit, projecting the image of a successful CEO, while his actual company was secretly hemorrhaging cash. David adjusted his glasses and asked Preston to recount the exact events surrounding the signing of the napkin contract. I folded my hands in my lap and watched my brother commit a federal crime on the record. Preston leaned forward, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. It was mid-October 8 years ago, Preston said, looking at the court reporter to ensure she captured every word. Cassidy called me in a panic. She asked me to meet her at the Roasting Bean coffee shop. When I got there, she was crying. She said she had this brilliant idea for a logistics app, but her old computer had completely crashed. She begged me for help. She said if I bought her a new $500 laptop, she would give me 20% of the company. I grabbed a napkin, wrote up the terms, and she signed it right in front of me and our mother. It was a masterful performance. If I had not lived the actual memory of working night shifts at a diner to buy that laptop myself, I might have believed him. I did not interrupt. I just let the silence stretch, giving him enough rope to hang himself. David turned his attention to my mother. Catherine sat perfectly poised, her designer handbag resting on the table. David asked if she could corroborate Preston's account under oath. Absolutely, my mother said, her voice smooth and practiced. I was sitting right next to Preston. Cassidy was making an absolute scene in the middle of the coffee shop, weeping and carrying on about how unfair her life was. She was always so dramatic, just desperately seeking attention. It was honestly exhausting. She snatched the pen from Preston and signed that napkin without a second thought. She was just grateful her brother was willing to bail her out. David paused, tapping his pen against his legal pad. He asked my mother to clarify why she remembered Cassidy being so dramatic that specific day. My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Cassidy has always been prone to hysterics when she does not get her way. She ruined family vacations with that exact same behavior. I remember when we planned to take Preston to Aspen for his high school graduation trip. We told Cassidy she needed to stay home and work because we could not afford a third ticket. Instead of being happy for her brother, she threw a massive tantrum and locked herself in her room. We had to leave for the airport, listening to her cry. So yes, sitting in that coffee shop watching her beg Preston for a computer, it was just classic Cassidy. I kept my face entirely blank, but inside my blood boiled. She was casually referencing the time they abandoned me alone for 2 weeks, with no grocery money, painting it as a character flaw of mine. They were so consumed by their own twisted narrative that they could not see the trap David and I had set. David pressed further, his tone deceptively mild. So, Catherine, you are swearing under oath that you clearly remember the logo on the napkin being present on that exact day 8 years ago? My mother rolled her eyes. Yes, of course. The roasting bean logo was right there. I remember it perfectly. David turned to Preston. And you, Preston, you testify under penalty of perjury that this specific napkin featuring the specific geometric coffee cup logo was signed 8 years ago. Preston smirked, crossing his arms. I already said yes. It is my napkin, my contract, and my 20%. Now, unless you have any more time-wasting questions, I think we are done here. My sister needs to stop stalling and hand over my $38 million. David closed his folder with a soft snap. I think we have everything we need for today, he said, his voice laced with a subtle, lethal satisfaction. We did not present the trademark timeline to them. We did not reveal that the roasting bean logo on that napkin did not exist until 2 years ago. We let them swear on the legal record to a completely fabricated timeline. They had legally dug their own graves, cementing their perjury in a court transcript. The court reporter stopped typing. The tension in the room broke into a messy flurry of movement as everyone began packing their bags. Preston stood up, adjusting his tie, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He leaned over the table, glaring at me. You should have just co-signed the loan, Cassidy. Now you are going to lose everything. I did not respond. I simply stood up and put on my trench coat, grabbing my briefcase. My mother gave me one last look of sheer disgust before turning to follow Preston out the door. Simone was the last to leave their side of the table. She had not said a single word during the entire deposition. She calmly stacked her legal pads and placed them into her designer briefcase. As Preston and my mother walked out into the hallway, Simone moved toward the door, passing directly behind my chair. She did not look at me. She did not break her stride, but as she brushed past my coat, I felt a slight weight drop into my pocket. Check the offshore folders, she whispered. I walked out of the corporate building and immediately hailed a black car, the heavy metal of the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I did not go back to my apartment. I headed straight to the secure office bunker I maintained downtown, a facility equipped with air-gapped servers and enterprise-grade firewalls. Preston and my parents were arrogant, but Simone was calculating. If she was handing me data, she knew exactly what its impact would be. I slipped into my private suite, booted up my offline terminal, and inserted the encrypted drive. The screen flashed a stark black prompt demanding a 32-character alphanumeric password. Before I could even attempt a bypass protocol, my burner phone vibrated against the cold metal desk. It was an unlisted number. I answered on the second ring, letting the heavy silence hang between us. "Hello, Cassidy," Simone said. Her voice drifted through the speaker, crisp, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of the deferential tone she always used around my family. I did not ask how she got this highly secure number. I knew she was a forensic auditor by trade, a woman who specialized in finding things people desperately wanted kept hidden. "You found the drive, I assume." I told her I was staring at the password prompt right now. Simone let out a dry, humorless exhale. "Preston thinks he is playing chess," she said, the disdain in her voice cutting through the static. "But he is playing a childish game with Monopoly money. I refuse to go down with a man who is legally, morally, and financially bankrupt. My husband is a sinking ship, and I am stepping off before the water reaches my knees. I have watched his incompetence quietly for years, waiting for this exact moment." I leaned back in my chair, asking her why she was doing this right now. She had sat quietly at family dinners for 6 long years, constantly watching them belittle me. She had perfectly played the role of the supportive wife, while Preston deliberately drove the family freight business into the ground. Simone offered a response that was sharp and immediate. She told me I had absolutely no idea what her reality looked like behind closed doors. For years, she had noticed glaring discrepancies in their joint checking accounts, missing transfers, and phantom wire fees. Whenever she, a highly certified auditor, questioned her own husband about exactly where the money was going, Preston would patronize her. He actually looked me in the eye and told me, "I just did not understand how generational wealth worked," Simone hissed, the raw anger finally cracking her pristine facade. "He used my background against me. He played on the fact that I was the first woman of color to marry into your insufferable privileged family, acting like my valid concerns were just the paranoia of someone who did not grow up with significant money. He relentlessly gaslit me into questioning my own professional expertise just to cover up his pathetic sloppy tracks. I suffered his arrogance while he recklessly endangered our future. I felt a flicker of genuine respect for her. My family had always underestimated Simone, incorrectly assuming her total silence simply meant complete submission. They had absolutely no idea they had invited a dangerous wolf directly into the henhouse. I asked her what she ultimately wanted. Simone did not hesitate. "I want out of this miserable marriage with my professional reputation and my personal finances completely intact," she stated flatly. "But more importantly than that, I want a career entirely free from the heavy anchor of the toxic Preston name. I know all about your exciting new post-acquisition venture, Cassidy. I know you are launching an elite incubator for innovative logistics startups. I want a senior executive position at your firm. I want to be your chief financial officer. In exchange, I will give you the absolute smoking gun that will destroy Preston and his frivolous civil suit, dismantle his fake contract, and burn the corrupt family business to the ground." I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen. It was an incredibly steep price, but acquiring a brilliant chief financial officer with intimate insider knowledge of my enemy and his complex financial structure was a tactical masterstroke. I told her we had a deal. Simone quickly rattled off the complex 32-character password. I typed it in flawlessly, hitting the enter key. The progress bar loaded, and a massive directory of files appeared on my high-resolution monitor. Simone told me to carefully open the master folder labeled Offshore Discrepancies. As I clicked through the heavily encrypted documents and secret bank ledgers, my breath caught painfully in my throat. I gasped, leaning much closer to the screen to fiercely ensure my eyes were not completely deceiving me. Preston had not just been making poor business decisions or losing corporate money to bad overseas investments. The highly detailed ledgers revealed a systematic, aggressive embezzlement scheme. Over the last 4 years, Preston had illegally siphoned exactly $4.5 million directly from his biggest shipping client and their highly protected escrow accounts. He had intentionally rerouted the stolen funds through multiple dummy shell corporations to actively cover massive recurring underground sports gambling debts. He was not just a failing executive, he was facing a decade in federal prison. I sat back slowly realizing that my arrogant brother had unwittingly handed me the perfect weapon to ensure my absolute victory. This meticulously hidden evidence would obliterate him entirely, ending this vicious nightmare once and for all. He had absolutely no idea what was rapidly coming. I watched the data finish downloading onto my secure server, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief wash over my exhausted body. Preston wanted to steal my life, but instead he had just guaranteed his own utter destruction. The tables were permanently turned, and I was finally ready to strike back. Check, mate. The monitor cast a harsh light across David's face as we stared in absolute silence at the decrypted offshore ledgers. Simone had delivered exactly what she promised. The evidence was irrefutable, meticulously catalogued by a woman who had spent years quietly suffering my family's condescension while holding the keys to their destruction. Row after row of wire transfers, dummy accounts, and fabricated vendor invoices painted a crystal-clear picture of financial ruin. Preston had systematically siphoned $4.5 million from his primary shipping client. Every stolen cent was funneled directly into offshore gambling syndicates. He was a desperate addict committing severe federal crimes. David dragged his hands down his face, removing his glasses. He shook his head at the sheer stupidity of my brother's actions. "This is not a civil dispute anymore, Cassidy," David stated, his voice deadly serious. "This is wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. If this client discovers even a small fraction of what Preston has done, your brother is going to federal prison for 10 long years. And it does not stop with him." David pointed to the screen tracing the illicit funds through the main corporate accounts of Wilson Manufacturing. "Your father is the majority shareholder and the signatory on these primary escrow accounts. William's signature is right there, rubber stamping the fabricated payments. Preston used your father's blind trust to facilitate the theft. If this goes public, William is going down as a co-conspirator. The entire family legacy will be completely eradicated overnight." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the immense magnitude of the power currently resting at my fingertips. A single phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation would end the lawsuit immediately. Authorities would raid Wilson Manufacturing by morning. Preston would be arrested in his custom-tailored suit, and my parents would face the agonizing humiliation of a highly publicized federal indictment broadcast across the local news. It was the perfect revenge. It was exactly what they deserved after years of treating me like an ungrateful burden. But as I reached for my cell phone, a cold, calculating calm washed over my body. I pulled my hand back and placed it on the glass desk. Handing this incredibly sensitive information over to the authorities right now was simply too easy. It would take the complete control entirely out of my hands. My parents had spent my entire life dictating the terms of my existence, attempting to forcefully control my narrative, and trying to hold my hard-earned wealth hostage. I did not just want them properly punished by a faceless judge. I wanted absolute, undeniable, and total leverage. I wanted them to unconditionally surrender. I told David to shut and close his laptop. "We are not calling the authorities," I instructed firmly. David blinked, clearly shocked by my extreme restraint. He started to protest, reminding me that we finally had the silver bullet to end Preston's extortion instantly. I sharply cut him off. I calmly explained that a silver bullet is only useful if you decide to fire it. I wanted to press and hold the loaded gun directly to their arrogant heads. I needed to know exactly who Preston had stolen this massive fortune from. If I was going to successfully use this unprecedented leverage, I deeply and truly needed to understand the victim. I leaned closer to the monitor, carefully scanning the fabricated vendor invoices Simone had isolated. The target of Preston's embezzlement was a Midwestern logistics hub based out of Ohio. It was a massive corporate account generating the vast bulk of the daily revenue that kept Wilson Manufacturing looking profitable on paper. David sighed heavily, immediately recognizing that I had completely made up my mind. He pulled his ergonomic keyboard closer and began typing rapidly, running the targeted logistics hub through a comprehensive global corporate registry database. He needed to find out exactly who was sitting on the primary board of directors for the victim company, actively looking for the specific individuals Preston had been secretly defrauding for years. The blue progress bar on David's computer screen loaded as the complex corporate hierarchy populated. This logistics hub was not an independent operational entity, David noted aloud, tracing the intricate corporate structure upwards with his pen. They were privately owned for decades, but it strongly looks like they were recently acquired during a massive industry consolidation sweep. He quickly clicked on the parent company's central holding file, expanding the ownership details. David Feist urgently need the actual name of the parent company. I demanded my patience wearing incredibly thin. I deeply needed to know who held the ultimate financial leash. David stared at the screen, eyes widening in disbelief. He turned the monitor toward me, tapping his finger against the bold corporate header at the very top of the ownership tree. The Midwestern logistics hub that Preston had been bleeding dry for 4 years was now a wholly owned subsidiary of a much larger parent corporation. I looked at the name glowing brightly on the screen. It was Atlas Global Technologies. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked repeatedly, reading the powerful name a second time to be absolutely certain. A strange, bubbling sensation started deep in my chest. It rose upward, escaping my lips as a sharp gasp, which morphed into a quiet chuckle. Within seconds, I was leaning over the glass desk, laughing uncontrollably. My laughter echoed off the cold glass walls of the silent office. David watched me utterly bewildered as I wiped a tear of vindictive joy from my eye. Atlas Global Technologies was the exact same tech giant that had just purchased my logistics software. They were the corporate entity who had paid me $190 million. Preston had stolen $4.5 million directly from the people who now legally owned my company. And as a senior executive and board member of Atlas Global Technologies, I technically represented the victim. 2 days later, the sterile fluorescent lighting of the downtown civil courthouse offered no place for Preston or my mother to hide. We sat before Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense magistrate who had zero tolerance for frivolous litigation. Preston sat with his legs crossed, projecting the same manufactured confidence he had worn during the previous deposition. My mother adjusted her silk scarf, looking supremely bored. They both believed today was a mere formality, a simple rubber stamp to maintain the injunction on my $190 million. They had no idea David was holding a forensic demolition charge. Judge Harrison asked David if we were prepared to formally submit our defense against the napkin contract. David stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He approached the bench and handed the judge a thick-bound dossier. "We are not just submitting a defense, Your Honor," David stated, his voice resonating through the quiet courtroom. "We are submitting definitive proof of fraud, perjury, and the fabrication of evidence." Preston uncrossed his legs, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. David clicked a remote, bringing up a high-resolution projection of the napkin on the courtroom monitor. He walked the judge through the timeline we had established. The logo printed on the napkin, the geometric coffee cup from the roasting bean, was officially commissioned and copyrighted exactly 2 years ago. We submitted sworn affidavits from the graphic design firm that created it, along with the trademark registration files. My brother and my mother swore under oath that this exact napkin was signed 8 years ago, unless they possess a time machine. This document is a physical impossibility. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the plaintiff's table. Preston stared at the screen, his jaw muscles visibly clenching. My mother looked frantically between David and her own attorney, who suddenly looked physically ill. But David was not finished. He pulled out a secondary report from an independent forensic laboratory. "Furthermore, Your Honor, we expedited a chemical analysis of the ink used on the napkin. The specific gel compound in the pen used to write the contract terms was manufactured by Pilot exactly 14 months ago. The paper fibers show zero signs of aged degradation. This contract was not written 8 years ago. It was written recently purely to extort my client out of her legally acquired corporate buyout. Judge Harrison flipped through the official reports, her face darkening with immense fury. She looked down at Preston, whose arrogant facade had completely melted into sheer panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but his attorney swiftly placed a hand over his arm, silencing him immediately. Catherine sat completely frozen, her designer handbag slipping from her lap and hitting the floor with a dull thud. "This is an absolute disgrace to this court," Judge Harrison said, her voice dripping with lethal contempt. She slammed the file shut forcefully. "This napkin is a definitive, undeniable forgery. The plaintiff has deliberately wasted the time and resources of the judicial system while attempting to execute a massive financial theft. I am immediately dissolving the temporary injunction. Miss Wilson, your funds are entirely unfrozen effective right now." She then turned her piercing gaze back to Preston and my mother. "As for the two of you, lying under oath is a severe felony. You have both committed blatant perjury on the record. While I strictly preside over civil matters, I am forwarding this entire transcript and the forensic evidence directly to the district attorney's office. I strongly suggest you both retain criminal defense counsel immediately. We are adjourned." The wooden gavel cracked against the block like a gunshot. I walked out of the heavy double doors into the marble hallway, feeling the invisible weight of the injunction finally lift off my shoulders. Before I could even reach the elevators, my father stepped directly into my path. William had watched the entire proceeding from the gallery, and his face was red with pure, unfiltered rage. But his anger was not directed at the wife and son who had just committed a felony against his daughter. It was directed entirely at me. "How could you do this?" William demanded, his voice echoing sharply down the long corridor. "You just humiliated your family in front of a judge. You set a trap for your own brother. You could have handled this quietly, Cassidy, but instead you chose to publicly destroy us." I stared at the man who had raised me, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over my mind. He had just watched my mother and brother try to illegally steal my life's work, and his only concern was the public embarrassment of their failure. "They committed fraud, Dad," I said coldly. "They lied under oath to steal my money, and you are angry at me for defending myself." I stepped around him without waiting for an answer. I had completely outgrown my need for his approval, and I no longer cared about his warped sense of family loyalty. I left the courthouse and got into the back of my waiting car. I immediately pulled out my secured laptop and logged into my primary banking portal. The red banner indicating the judicial freeze was gone. My account balance glowed back at me, a staggering $190 million free and clear. I did not hesitate. I initiated a secure wire transfer of $10 million, routing the massive sum into a newly formed anonymous shell company I had established earlier that morning. The entity was named Vanguard Capital. Once the transfer cleared, I picked up my phone and called David. He answered instantly, the adrenaline of our court victory still evident in his voice. "We won the battle, Cassidy," he said, "but we are about to win the entire war." I replied, my voice steady and unyielding. "The money is free and Vanguard Capital is officially funded. It is time to buy my brother's corporate debt, all of it." David did not waste a single second. Within an hour of my phone call, Vanguard Capital was completely operational as an aggressive debt acquisition vehicle. Operating under layers of ironclad corporate anonymity, David reached out to the financial officers at the Midwestern Logistics Hub, now owned by Atlas Global Technologies. He presented them with a highly lucrative, entirely discreet offer. Vanguard Capital would purchase the $4.5 million of toxic, unresolved debt currently sitting on their ledgers, paying 80 cents on the dollar in pure cash. For a subsidiary dealing with messy post-acquisition audits and desperate to clear their balance sheets of non-performing assets, it was an absolute miracle. They happily signed over the rights to collect the debt, executing the transfer documents within hours. They were completely unaware that they were handing me the ultimate weapon to destroy my own brother. But I was not satisfied with simply cornering Preston. I wanted the entire board wiped clean. I booted up my primary terminal and launched the proprietary data scraping algorithms I had designed during the early days of my startup. My family always sneered at my computer hobby, consistently telling me that technology was a fleeting trend and that real power only existed in traditional manufacturing and country club handshakes. They completely failed to understand the lethal power of raw data. While they relied on outdated prestige, I relied on ruthless, calculated efficiency. I unleashed my code to bypass standard credit checks, diving deep into public county records, hidden offshore collateral registries, and obscure corporate loan databases. The algorithms relentlessly scoured the digital footprint of Wilson Manufacturing and William Wilson's personal estate, cross-referencing property deeds, with commercial liens extracting decades of buried financial transactions. The results populated on my massive curved monitor, and the sheer level of financial negligence was genuinely breathtaking. My parents projected the pristine image of untouchable East Coast aristocrats. They hosted lavish charity dinners, drove luxury European vehicles, and wore bespoke clothing to project absolute financial dominance. The reality was a fragile, rotting house of cards built on staggering, unmanageable debt. To keep Preston's failing freight business afloat and artificially inflate his exorbitant CEO salary, William had secretly leveraged everything he owned. He had quietly taken out massive secondary and tertiary mortgages on the sprawling family estate in Fairfield. He had aggressively borrowed against his own life insurance policies and completely drained the company's emergency liquidity funds. My parents were drowning in over $8 million of high-interest institutional debt. They were highly over-leveraged, functionally insolvent, and desperately shifting money between various accounts just to make the minimum monthly payments. I immediately forwarded the complete financial dossier to David with a single uncompromising directive: buy it all. Over the next 48 hours, I watched the brutal clinical efficiency of modern American corporate takeovers unfold from the cold glow of my office screens. Vanguard Capital moved like an apex predator in the financial markets. David deployed my newly unfrozen funds with surgical precision. He targeted the regional banks and aggressive private lenders currently holding William's secondary mortgages. These financial institutions were already highly nervous about the precarious state of Wilson Manufacturing and the persistent rumors of Preston's gross incompetence. When Vanguard Capital swooped in offering to buy the high-risk mortgages outright with guaranteed liquid cash, the banks eagerly sold them off to minimize their own exposure. They rapidly offloaded the toxic assets, transferring the exclusive rights of foreclosure directly to my anonymous shell company. I sat in my ergonomic chair drinking black coffee and watching the digital ledgers update in real time. For 31 years, my father had ruled our family through absolute financial control. He had used money to manipulate my mother to spoil and enable Preston and to routinely punish me for my independence. He genuinely believed his wealth made him a god among men. He had loudly proclaimed that failures did not belong in his family. Now an algorithm I wrote in my cramped college dorm room had effortlessly mapped out his total ruin. I was buying his monumental hubris for pennies on the dollar. Simone's embezzled data was the fatal strike against Preston, but this aggressive debt acquisition was the final nail in the coffin for my parents. I had effectively purchased the very ground they walked on. The sprawling colonial mansion where I was once told I was a severe disappointment now legally belonged to Vanguard Capital. The manufacturing legacy my father constantly held over my head was entirely at my mercy. I did not feel an ounce of guilt or hesitation. My family had explicitly chosen greed, perjury, and fraud over their own daughter. I was simply responding in the exact language they understood best. By Thursday evening, the final wire transfers cleared the international banking protocols. The aggressive acquisition phase was officially complete. I was reviewing a newly generated legal summary outlining my vast new portfolio when my secure phone rang. I picked it up, staring at the panoramic view of the city skyline through my office window. "It is done," David said, his voice carrying a mixture of profound awe and sheer intimidation. "I am looking at the fully executed transfer deeds and the finalized corporate assignments right now. The logistics debt is ours. The secondary mortgages on the Fairfield estate are ours. The commercial liens on Wilson Manufacturing are ours." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power of the moment solidify in my bones. I asked him to clarify my exact legal standing. David did not hesitate. "You are now the sole creditor of your family's business and your parents' estate," he confirmed, reading directly from the compiled legal dossiers. "You hold every single string. If you pull the plug, they are homeless and bankrupt by Friday." "Good," I replied, my voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of mercy. "Send me an invite to their gala." 48 hours later, the crisp evening air of Illinois whipped around my ankles as I stepped out of my chauffeured car. My parents had spared absolutely no expense for their annual charity gala at the ultra-exclusive Lakeside Country Club in Chicago. The massive stone facade of the clubhouse was illuminated by theatrical spotlights, projecting the illusion of untouchable prosperity. Valets scrambled to park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles, while string quartets played softly in the manicured courtyard. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of elite socialites, politicians, and business magnates. William and Catherine were holding court near the extravagant champagne tower, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were currently standing on the edge of a massive financial cliff. They were hosting this opulent event to publicly celebrate Preston's supposedly brilliant upcoming corporate expansion. I smoothed the skirt of my custom midnight blue silk gown, the fabric whispering quietly as I moved. I wore no flashy jewelry, only a simple, flawless diamond pendant. True wealth does not need to scream, it only needs to be present. I walked through the towering oak doors, handing my coat to a completely bewildered attendant. I did not have to wait long for the inevitable confrontation. I was standing near the edge of the dance floor, nursing a glass of sparkling water when Preston noticed me. The color instantly drained from his face, quickly replaced by a furious dark red flush. He aggressively excused himself from a circle of wealthy investors marching across the polished marble floor with a look of pure murder in his eyes. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket that screamed desperation, a sartorial choice meant to project the image of a visionary CEO. "What are you doing here?" Cassidy Preston hissed, stopping just inches from my face. His breath smelled heavily of expensive scotch and raw panic. "I did not invite you to my celebration." I took a slow sip of water. I told him I was simply here to support the family business. I wanted to hear all about his highly anticipated corporate expansion. Preston sneered, crossing his arms defensively. "You are incredibly pathetic," he spat. "You lost in court, you failed to block my contract, and now you are crashing my gala to beg for relevance. We are about to launch a massive Midwestern logistics hub, Cassidy. I am expanding our empire while you play with shell companies. You do not belong here. You never have." He raised his hand, snapping his fingers sharply to catch the attention of the event staff. Two large men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the perimeter wall, moving swiftly toward us. Preston smirked, leaning in close to my ear. "I am having you thrown out. Trash is not allowed at the Lakeside Country Club." As the heavy footsteps of the security guards approached, a deeply buried memory forced its way to the surface of my mind. I stared at the intricate gold leaf molding on the ballroom ceiling, remembering the exact last time I had stood in this opulent building. It was the night of my high school graduation. While my wealthy classmates celebrated with their families in the grand dining room, I was sitting alone in a cheap diner down the street. My parents had explicitly uninvited me to my own graduation dinner. Catherine had stood in the foyer of our house looking me up and down with an expression of profound distaste, telling me that my thrift store dress and exhausted demeanor simply did not have the right look for the Lakeside Country Club. She claimed I would embarrass William in front of his important associates. They had left me behind, prioritizing their shallow social standing over their own daughter milestone achievement. The sting of that rejection had burned for years, fueling the relentless drive that pushed me to build my software empire. I had promised myself that night that I would never again allow anyone to dictate where I was allowed to stand. The two imposing security guards finally reached us. Preston stepped back dramatically, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Escort this woman off the premises." Immediately, Preston ordered, pitching his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "She is trespassing on a private event." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I simply waited. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with an earpiece, stepped directly between Preston and me, but he did not reach for my arm. He did not ask me to leave. Instead, he stopped abruptly, planted his feet, and bowed his head respectfully in my direction. "Good evening, Miss Wilson," the head of security said, his voice echoing clearly over the ambient noise of the gala. "Is everything satisfactory with the event setup?" Preston's smug smile completely collapsed. He looked at the guard, then back to me, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, his voice cracking with sudden uncontrollable panic. "I told you to throw her out." The head of security did not even acknowledge my brother's frantic outburst. He kept his eyes focused on me, waiting for my explicit command. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's silver tray and took a slow, calculated step toward Preston. I watched the arrogant facade finally shatter, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man who suddenly realized he was no longer in control. "I forgot to mention a minor detail regarding your celebration tonight, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the space like a surgical blade. "Yesterday morning, my wealth management firm purchased a 51% controlling stake in the hospitality group that owns Lakeside Country Club." I leaned in close, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his impending doom. "You cannot throw me out, Preston. You are currently standing on my property." Preston's jaw hung slack, his brain completely failing to process the reality of the situation. The color drained from his face, leaving him an ashen gray. He stood completely paralyzed, rooted to the marble floor, as the crushing weight of my words finally connected. He looked frantically at the head of security, desperately hoping the man would laugh and drag me out by the arm. Instead, the guard took a disciplined step backward, assuming a protective stance behind my shoulder. The message was unmistakable. Preston was not the king of this castle. He was merely a trespasser in my kingdom, entirely at my mercy. Across the ballroom, my father sensed the disturbance. William Wilson had spent 4 decades cultivating a hypersensitivity to public perception, and he immediately detected the sudden shift in the room's energy. He saw Preston standing frozen like a cornered animal, saw the guards deferring to me, and saw the surrounding high society guests beginning to whisper. Panicking that a scene was about to erupt and tarnish his precious, heavily leveraged gala, William swiftly abandoned his circle of wealthy investors. He marched purposefully toward the main stage, his face set in a rigid mask. He needed to reassert control. He desperately needed to forcefully hijack the narrative before the whispers could escalate into full-blown rumors. William climbed the short stairs to the stage and sharply tapped the microphone. A harsh screech of audio feedback echoed through the grand ballroom, instantly silencing the ambient chatter and forcing the string quartet to abruptly halt their playing. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the stage. William straightened his posture, gripping the podium with practiced authority. He forced a booming, jovial laugh that sounded entirely artificial. He welcomed the elite crowd, thanking the local politicians and corporate magnates for attending. He boldly proclaimed that tonight was a historic milestone for the future of Wilson Manufacturing. He gestured toward the dance floor, pointing directly at Preston, who was still sweating and trembling. "I want to take this moment to publicly recognize my son William," announced his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "Preston is a visionary leader who is taking our family legacy into the modern era. Thanks to his relentless dedication, Wilson Manufacturing is stronger than ever." I am thrilled to announce that Preston has just successfully secured a massive $4.5 million influx of new capital. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the ballroom. I stared at my father, utterly disgusted by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He was spinning a magnificent, desperate lie, attempting to disguise a massive criminal embezzlement scheme as a legitimate corporate investment. He was falsely claiming this imaginary capital would fund a revolutionary logistics hub. But William was not finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, laying the hypocrisy on so thick it was practically suffocating. This incredible financial milestone was not just achieved through business acumen, William declared passionately. It was achieved through Preston's unparalleled honesty and integrity. He is the moral backbone of this company. He represents the very best of our family values, proving that hard work and ethical leadership still yield the greatest rewards. Standing by the edge of the dance floor, listening to this nauseating speech, I felt a sharp phantom ache radiate through my lower back and my hands. I looked down at my palms, tracing the faint permanent lines of the physical scars I still carried. While William was praising Preston's supposed work ethic, my mind flashed back to the brutal reality of my college years. I remembered the burning sensation of cheap chemical cleaners eating into my skin when I worked the midnight shift, scrubbing industrial kitchen floors. I remembered the agonizing exhaustion of hauling heavy event equipment every weekend, completely destroying my back just to afford my textbooks and rent. I practically broke my own body, working 3 separate manual labor jobs to survive. And what was Preston doing during those years? He was maxing out our parents' platinum credit cards. He was crashing luxury cars, partying on rented yachts, and failing his entry-level business classes. He never worked a single day in his life. And now my father was standing on a brightly lit stage, literally praising a desperate addict for stealing money, while completely ignoring the daughter who had actually built a legitimate empire through blood, sweat, and undeniable brilliance. It was the ultimate, unforgivable insult. I turned my gaze away from my father and looked up at the elevated audiovisual booth situated at the very back of the ballroom. As the new majority owner of this entire hospitality group, every single employee in this building, from the valets to the security guards to the technical staff, now answered directly to my firm. The lead AV technician was waiting, watching me intently through the glass window. I raised my hand slightly and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Instantly, the massive high-definition presentation screen situated directly behind William flashed violently black. The sudden absence of light drew gasps from the crowd. Then the screen illuminated with a blinding white intensity. Instead of the Wilson Manufacturing corporate logo, the display loudly projected the highly confidential Vanguard Capital debt acquisition documents. The text was massive, undeniable, and utterly damning. The financial records were highlighted in bright, aggressive red ink for every single elite guest in the room to read clearly. The screen boldly displayed the exact details of the $4.5 million embezzlement from the Atlas Global subsidiary. It showed the fabricated vendor invoices, the illegal offshore wire transfers, and Preston's illicit gambling syndicate accounts. But the presentation did not stop there. The next slide transitioned seamlessly, displaying the massive secondary mortgages William had secretly taken out. The final document projected onto the screen was the official legally binding notice of impending foreclosure on William's sprawling Fairfield mansion. The entire facade of their wealth, their integrity, and their success was instantly and brutally reduced to ashes. The harsh, blinding light from the massive presentation screen washed over the grand ballroom, plunging the high society gala into a state of absolute breathless paralysis. The string quartet had completely ceased playing. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped entirely. Hundreds of Chicago's most elite socialites, politicians, and corporate magnates stood frozen in their designer evening wear, their eyes darting rapidly between the damning Vanguard Capital foreclosure documents glowing on the screen, and my father standing at the podium. William looked as though the oxygen had been violently sucked from his lungs. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the edges of the wooden lectern. He opened his mouth attempting to formulate a cohesive sentence, but only a dry, guttural gasp escaped his throat. I did not wait for him to recover his manufactured composure. I stepped away from the audiovisual booth at the back of the ballroom and began walking directly down the center aisle. The crowd instinctively parted for me, creating a wide, unobstructed path to the stage. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision, the heavy silk of my midnight blue gown gliding silently across the polished marble floor. I climbed the short set of stairs and stepped onto the stage, approaching the podium where my father remained, completely immobilized by his sudden public destruction. William stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. He raised a trembling hand, attempting to physically block me from the microphone, but his authoritative aura had entirely evaporated. I reached out and firmly pried the microphone from his rigid fingers. He offered zero resistance, stepping backward into the harsh glare of the projector screen detailing his financial ruin. I turned to face the vast sea of wealthy guests. I adjusted the microphone stand, letting the sharp feedback echo briefly to ensure I commanded every ounce of attention in the room. My father is absolutely right about the $4.5 million, I announced, my voice steady, cold, and echoing powerfully through the grand ballroom. He was perfectly accurate regarding the exact monetary figure. However, he lied to you about the source. That money was not a capital investment. It was not a brilliant strategic expansion secured by a visionary leader. It was stolen. It was meticulously and illegally embezzled by my brother Preston from his primary logistics client to fund illicit offshore gambling syndicates. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. I gestured behind me toward the glowing red figures on the projection screen. The documents you are reading are entirely authentic. I continued, maintaining unwavering eye contact with the crowd. Vanguard Capital is my private wealth management firm. Yesterday afternoon, I aggressively acquired the entirety of my family's toxic debt. I bought the embezzled corporate ledgers. I bought the hidden secondary mortgages on the Fairfield estate. I bought every single commercial lien holding Wilson Manufacturing together. And as the sole owner of Vanguard Capital and the exclusive creditor of this estate, I am officially calling in the debt. Effective immediately. The reaction was instantaneous and brutally unforgiving. In the elite circles of American high society, experiencing a sudden financial downturn is considered a regrettable sin. But getting caught publicly stealing and fabricating wealth is absolute social suicide. The crowd immediately began murmuring, physically backing away from the stage and the tables closest to the Wilson family. Investors who had been clinking glasses with Preston mere minutes ago now turned their backs aggressively, signaling to their spouses to gather their coats. Corporate allies pulled out their phones, frantically typing messages to their legal teams to sever all ties with Wilson Manufacturing. The social execution was swift, silent, and permanent. My parents were no longer respected industry titans. They were radioactive pariahs. Down on the floor, Catherine attempted to grab the arm of a prominent judge's wife, desperately trying to whisper a frantic explanation. The woman sharply pulled her arm away, looking at my mother with undisguised revulsion before walking briskly toward the exit. Catherine covered her mouth, a stifled sob escaping her lips as her entire social universe evaporated before her eyes. Preston stood near the edge of the dance floor, entirely consumed by a violent, suffocating panic. The arrogant sneer had been completely wiped from his face. His chest heaved erratically as his eyes darted from the damning screen to the retreating guests and finally to the exit doors. He knew the undeniable reality of his situation. The money was gone. His reputation was obliterated. The authorities would undoubtedly be reviewing the public evidence by morning. He needed an immediate, massive influx of liquid cash just to retain a criminal defense attorney and flee the state. Desperation hijacked his rational thought. Preston spun around, frantically scanning the remaining crowd until he spotted his wife Simone sitting quietly in the front row. He practically lunged toward her, abandoning all remaining pretense of dignity. Simone, Preston yelled, his voice cracking hysterically as he grabbed the back of her chair. "You need to call your father right now. Tell him it is a massive emergency. Tell him I need $5 million wired to my private account by midnight. They have the funds. Just tell them it is a temporary bridge loan. Do it right now." The few guests lingering near the front row stopped and stared at the pathetic display. Preston was loudly begging his wife's family to bail him out of a federal crime. Simone did not flinch. She did not reach for her phone. She slowly stood up from her chair, her posture impeccably straight, and her expression entirely devoid of emotion. She looked at her husband, the man who had treated her like a convenient accessory for years, and calmly opened her designer clutch. She pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope and held it out to him. "I am not calling my family," Simone stated, her voice carrying a quiet, lethal finality that cut through his frantic shouting. "But you can certainly call your lawyer. These are divorce papers." The mass exodus from the Lakeside Country Club Grand Ballroom was a spectacular display of high society self-preservation. No one wanted to be caught anywhere near the blast radius of a highly publicized federal embezzlement scandal. The wealthy Chicago socialites, the local politicians, and the ruthless corporate magnates fled toward the exits with desperate, uncoordinated haste. The elegant string quartet had long since packed away their instruments and vanished into the night. The valets outside were completely overwhelmed by the frantic, shouted demands for luxury vehicles. Within 10 short minutes, the opulent hall was entirely deserted, save for the discarded crystal champagne flutes, the half-eaten gourmet cheese appetizers, and my shattered family standing in the absolute center of the wreckage. The deafening silence of the empty ballroom was broken only by my mother's ragged, erratic breathing. Catherine stood near the head table, clutching the back of a gold Chiavari chair so tightly her knuckles were completely translucent. Her meticulously curated social empire had just been vaporized in front of her very eyes. William looked physically ill, swaying slightly on his feet. The commanding, arrogant patriarch who had confidently taken the stage a quarter of an hour ago was entirely gone. In his place stood an aging, highly over-leveraged man staring directly at the glaring projector screen that boldly broadcast his impending foreclosure and complete financial ruin to an empty room. William slowly turned his gaze away from the projected Vanguard Capital documents and locked his eyes onto his golden child. His face was devoid of color, yet his eyes burned with a terrifying, desperate intensity. He marched heavily across the polished dance floor toward Preston, who was still staring blankly at the divorce papers Simone had just shoved hard into his chest. "Tell me that screen is lying," William demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Tell me right now that you did not steal $4.5 million from our primary logistics client to pay off illegal gambling debts." Preston backed away from our father, his entire body visibly trembling in his expensive velvet tuxedo. The manufactured confidence he had worn like an impenetrable shield his entire life completely shattered into a million pieces. He threw his arms up in a wild, erratic gesture, launching into a furious, unhinged tantrum. "It is a massive lie," Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a violently shaking finger directly at me. "She fabricated all of it to ruin my life. Cassidy set me up. She has been plotting this for years because she is insanely jealous of my success. She hacked the corporate accounts and planted those offshore transfers to destroy the company. I did not even bother to defend myself against the absurd, hysterical accusation. I simply stood by the edge of the stage, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold with cold, clinical detachment. Preston was actively drowning, and his immediate instinct was to pull anyone else down into the dark water with him. Simone stepped forward, her posture impeccably straight and her expression carved from solid ice. She did not yell, and she did not raise her voice to match his frantic pitch. She simply looked at her soon-to-be ex-husband with an expression of absolute withering pity. "Stop humiliating yourself," Preston Simone stated smoothly, her calm tones slicing cleanly through his frantic screaming. "Cassidy did not set you up, you completely destroyed yourself. I know exactly what you did, because I am the one who personally audited the books. I am the one who handed the decrypted offshore ledgers directly to your sister." William and Catherine gasped simultaneously, turning to stare at their daughter-in-law in pure horror. Preston's face contorted in sheer shock. "You sold me out!" Preston choked out, gripping the divorce papers so tightly the thick paper crumpled in his hands. I protected myself, Simone corrected, taking a calculated, menacing step toward him. For 4 agonizing years, I sat quietly at the dinner table while your parents foolishly praised your brilliant business acumen. Meanwhile, I was the one secretly managing your personal accounts and watching the disaster unfold. I saw the massive illegal wire transfers to anonymous shell companies hidden in the Cayman Islands. I watched you lose hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single weekend, betting on offshore sports syndicates. You were never expanding the family business, you were actively killing it. You lost 3 major shipping contracts in a single quarter because you were too hungover to attend the basic negotiation meetings. You systematically drained the company's emergency liquidity funds to desperately cover your mounting gambling losses. And when that money finally ran out, you started faking vendor invoices to bleed your biggest client completely dry. Simone methodically detailed his failures, her words landing like physical blows against his fragile ego. Your father took out a secret second mortgage on the Fairfield estate just to keep your payroll afloat, and you took that money and wired it directly to a bookie in Macau. You are not a visionary leader. You are an incompetent addict who committed massive federal wire fraud because you were too lazy to actually work for a living. I am leaving, and I am taking everything that is legally mine before the federal authorities freeze your remaining assets. With that final devastating financial breakdown, Simone turned on her heel and walked out of the ballroom, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Preston collapsed onto the polished floor, pulling his knees to his chest as the reality of his imminent federal indictment finally crushed him. William stumbled backward in shock, hitting the edge of a catering table. Suddenly, Catherine broke away from the tables. Catherine, crying, ran directly to me and grabbed my hands. She begged, her eyes wide with sheer terror. "Cassidy, please, we are family. You have $190 million. $4.5 million is nothing to you. Forgive the debt and we can be a real family again." I stared down at my mother. Catherine was clutching my fingers with a frantic, suffocating grip. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug sharply into my skin, attempting to forcefully bridge a chasm that had been widening for over a decade. Genuine tears were actually ruining her flawless, expensive makeup, cutting dark tracks down her cheeks. She was weaponizing the concept of family, desperately wielding the word as if it possessed some magical incantation, capable of erasing years of systematic abuse and financial fraud. "You have $190 million, she sobbed, her voice echoing shrilly across the deserted ballroom. $4.5 million is nothing to you, Cassidy. Just forgive the debt. Please, we can be a real family again." I did not pull away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute absurdity of her request settle into the heavy silence of the room. I looked at her hands wrapped around mine. Her skin was soft, untouched by a single day of actual labor, adorned with diamonds bought on credit and sustained by lies. I slowly, deliberately uncurled her fingers from my hands. I peeled her grip away with clinical precision, stepping back to ensure there was a clear physical boundary between us. "We have never been a real family, Catherine," I stated, my voice echoing cold and steady against the high, vaulted ceilings. "Family implies unconditional support. Family implies a safety net. What you and William built was a transactional social enterprise where Preston was the sole beneficiary and I was the designated sacrificial lamb. You do not want a daughter right now, you want a bailout." Catherine gasped, clutching her hands to her chest, as if she had been physically struck. William stepped forward, attempting to summon his extinguished patriarchal authority, but I held up a single hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Do not dare lecture me about family loyalty," I commanded, locking eyes with my mother. "You lost that right a long time ago. Let us talk about what your version of family actually looks like in practice. Let us talk about my sophomore year of college." I watched the color completely drain from Catherine's face as she realized exactly which memory I was about to drag into the light. I was 19 years old. I continued enunciating every single syllable with lethal clarity. I was working a double shift at the dining hall when my appendix ruptured. I was rushed to the emergency room in an ambulance screaming in agony. The hospital needed a $500 insurance copay before they would admit me for the emergency appendectomy. I called you from a gurney in the hallway begging for help because my account was overdrawn from buying textbooks. Do you remember what you told me, Catherine? My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked away, staring at the polished marble floor. You told me to put it on a credit card. I reminded her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. You told me you could not transfer the funds because you had just purchased a custom designer gown for Preston prestigious amateur golf tournament that weekend. You explicitly stated that it was crucial for the family image that you looked the part while supporting your son. You chose a dress over your daughter bursting internal organ. I lay in a hospital corridor terrified and completely alone negotiating a payment plan with a billing administrator while they prepped me for surgery. I took a step closer to her, forcing her to look up and meet my gaze. That is your definition of family, I said. Your love was always conditional, completely dependent on how well we served your social narrative. Preston played the role of the visionary heir, so you funded his delusions and covered up his crimes. I refused to play the quiet, subservient background character, so you threw me to the wolves. You systematically starved me of affection, resources, and basic human decency, expecting me to eventually fail and come crawling back to beg for your approval. But I did not fail. I built a fortress. And now you are standing outside my gates demanding I lower the drawbridge because you suddenly remember we share the same bloodline. I turned my attention to William, who was leaning heavily against the catering table. I am not forgiving a single cent of that debt, I declared, sweeping my gaze across the three of them. I bought Vanguard Capital specifically to acquire this leverage. I bought your commercial loans, I bought your mortgages, and I bought the undeniable proof of Preston federal wire fraud. I own your financial existence, and I am calling the markers due today. Preston let out a pathetic muffled sob from his place on the floor, still clutching his divorce papers. Here is your reality. I continued, my tone entirely devoid of pity or hesitation. You have exactly 48 hours to produce $4.5 million in liquid cash. If the funds are not wired into the Vanguard Capital holding account by this time on Sunday evening, I am handing the encrypted offshore embezzlement files directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Preston will be indicted for wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate theft. Simultaneously, I will hand the foreclosure documents to the county sheriff. The Fairfield estate will be seized, your remaining assets will be frozen, and the three of you will be publicly evicted on Monday morning. William staggered forward, his hands raised in surrender. Cassidy, please. He rasped, his voice trembling with genuine terror. We do not have that kind of liquidity. You know we do not. The banks will not touch us now. You are sentencing us to prison and homelessness. There has to be another way. We will do anything you want. You have 48 hours. Unless you agree to my alternative terms, meet me in your boardroom on Monday at 9 a.m. The heavy oak doors of the Wilson Manufacturing boardroom groaned in protest as I pushed them open at exactly 8:50. The space was a relic of my father and his outdated ego. Faded burgundy carpet stretched across the floor, smelling of stale cigar smoke and decades of stagnant ideas. The walls were lined with cheap wood paneling and framed photographs of William shaking hands with politicians who had long since been voted out of office or indicted. A bulky fax machine gathered dust in the corner, a fitting monument to a company that stubbornly refused to evolve. I walked straight to the massive, scratched mahogany table and took the leather chair at the head. That seat had belonged exclusively to William for 40 years. Today it was mine. David, my lead corporate attorney, took the seat to my right. He silently unpacked his briefcase, arranging a series of legal documents in perfectly aligned stacks. To my left sat Simone. She wore a charcoal suit, her posture impeccable, exuding the cold, calculated efficiency of a woman who had just shed a liability. Simone was no longer just my sister-in-law. After handing me the decrypted offshore ledgers on Saturday night, I had officially hired her as my lead financial advisor for this acquisition. She knew where every single stolen dollar was buried, making her the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal. She placed a sleek tablet on the table, tapping the screen to pull up the real-time financial models of the impending takeover. At 9 o'clock, the boardroom doors opened again. William, Catherine, and Preston shuffled into the room looking like ghosts of the socialites they had pretended to be just 48 hours prior. The physical toll of terror was written across their faces. Catherine wore dark sunglasses indoors, failing to conceal her eyes, and the fact that she had not slept a minute since the gala. Preston looked entirely hollowed out, his skin carrying a pallor. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, terrified to even glance in Simone's direction. William walked with a heavy limp, his usual imposing stride broken. He stared at me, sitting in his chair, but he lacked the energy to utter a word of protest. He sank into a chair near the middle of the table, clutching a briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of disorganized legal pads and bank statements, dropping them onto the mahogany surface. The visual juxtaposition was striking. On my side of the table, illuminated screens displayed instant digital data proving my absolute control. On his side lay the chaotic, desperate scribblings of an analog man losing his empire. No one spoke. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy with the weight of doom. I let them sit in their anxiety for 3 minutes. I watched Preston pick nervously at his cuticles until they bled. I watched Catherine stare blankly at a water stain on the ceiling. I wanted them to fully absorb the reality that their entire future rested entirely in the palm of my hand. Simone finally broke the silence. She tapped her tablet, and a digital contract instantly appeared on the large monitor mounted to the boardroom wall. The glaring light illuminated the exhaustion on my family's faces. "The 48-hour window has expired," I stated, my voice slicing through the stale air like a physical blade. "I checked the Vanguard Capital holding accounts precisely 2 minutes ago. The $4.5 million has not been wired. You are officially in default." Preston buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled groan. Catherine reached out and gripped William's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. William stared at the screen, his chest heaving. "We tried, Cassidy," he rasped. "We called every bank and private lender we know. The moment you projected those documents at the country club, our credit rating evaporated. We are completely blacklisted. We have nothing left to give you." I leaned back in the leather chair, folding my hands together on the table. "You have exactly one thing left of value," I corrected him. I tapped my tablet, sending a secondary document to the main screen. "I will forgive the debt," I announced, maintaining strict eye contact with my father. "I will permanently dissolve the Vanguard Capital foreclosure on the Fairfield estate. I will absorb the outstanding secondary mortgages, and I will ensure that the encrypted offshore ledgers never reach the desk of a federal prosecutor. I will not send Preston to federal prison." Preston's head snapped up, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his bloodshot eyes. "In exchange," I continued, "you will sign 100% of the voting shares of this company over to me. You will forfeit all executive control, all board seats, and all financial claims. You will walk away today and never return." The terms hung in the air, absolute and non-negotiable. I was offering them their freedom and their physical home, but I was demanding the total surrender of William's beloved legacy. For a long moment, William stared at the glowing contract. Then a terrifying transformation occurred. The posture of the broken man vanished. William straightened his spine, pushing his shoulders back. The color rushed into his face. An arrogant sneer curled his mouth. He locked his eyes onto mine, vibrating with toxic confidence. "You really thought it would be this easy, Cassidy?" William chuckled, the sound dripping with familiar condescension. "You thought you could just waltz into my boardroom with your shiny little tablets and steal the empire I built with my bare hands." I narrowed my eyes, sensing a sudden, unpredictable shift in the environment. David shifted uncomfortably beside me. "I am not signing my legacy over to you," William declared, slamming his hand down flat against his messy pile of legal pads. He sneered suddenly, looking incredibly confident. "I found a white knight investor. He is arriving right now." The heavy oak doors of the outdated boardroom swung inward with a dramatic, groaning creak that echoed harshly off the cheap wood paneling. The sudden noise shattered the suffocating tension that had settled over the room. A man stepped across the threshold, instantly altering the entire atmospheric pressure of the space. He was the absolute embodiment of modern, ruthless corporate power. He wore a sharply tailored midnight blue Tom Ford suit that likely cost more than the entire annual salary of my father's top freight manager. His posture was impeccably straight, his silver hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, calculating eyes immediately swept the room, assessing every single person present with clinical precision. William let out a sudden explosive breath that sounded like a bark of triumphant laughter. The pathetic, broken old man who had been cowering in his seat just moments ago vanished completely. In his place, the arrogant, entitled patriarch resurrected himself, fueled by the intoxicating illusion of a last-minute rescue. He pushed himself up from the mahogany table, his chest puffed out, aggressively smoothing the wrinkles of his suit jacket. Catherine reacted instantly to her husband's renewed confidence. She ripped the dark designer sunglasses off her face, tossing them carelessly onto the table. She sat up straight aggressively, wiping away the remaining traces of her mascara-stained tears, and hastily arranged her features into her classic haughty country club smile. Preston simply stared at the newcomer with wide, desperate eyes, clutching his legal pads like a drowning man holding onto a life preserver. William marched toward the door, extending his right hand enthusiastically. He did not even wait for the man to fully enter the room before launching into a triumphant, gloating speech directed entirely at me. "You honestly thought you had me backed into a corner," Cassidy, William boasted, his voice booming with arrogant pride. "You thought I was just going to roll over and surrender my grandfather's company because you bought up a few commercial loans. You underestimate me. You always have. I spent my entire weekend leveraging every single connection I have built over 40 years. I called every elite contact at the Lakeside Country Club. I cashed in favors with state senators, with private hedge fund managers, with people you could never even dream of meeting. And I secured a massive multi-million-dollar bailout from Omnitech, the largest tech conglomerate on the eastern seaboard." William turned his back to me, beaming brightly at the billionaire executive who was now standing a few feet inside the boardroom. "Thank God you are here," William declared, gesturing wildly toward where I sat at the head of the table. "My daughter is trying a hostile takeover. She is attempting to extort her own family with some fabricated embezzlement charges. We have the new equity contracts ready for your signature, and then we can have security throw her out." I did not move a single muscle. I sat perfectly still, flanked by David and Simone, watching the spectacle unfold with cold detachment. I did not interrupt my father's desperate monologue. I let him build his fragile house of cards as high as he possibly could, knowing exactly how satisfying it would be to watch it collapse. Simone sat to my left, her posture impeccable, quietly tapping her digital tablet and projecting the stark financial reality of the impending takeover onto the wall monitor. The juxtaposition of our sleek digital contracts against William's chaotic pile of scribbled legal pads perfectly illustrated the massive shift in power. The billionaire executive stopped walking. He looked down at William's outstretched, eager hand. The silence in the dingy boardroom stretched out heavy and suffocating. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The executive made absolutely no move to shake William's hand. He did not offer a polite smile. He simply stared at my father with an expression of profound, unadulterated amusement. William's confident smile began to falter. His outstretched arm wavered slightly in the air. The triumphant energy drained out of the room, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, her false smile tightening at the corners. Without uttering a single word to my father, the executive sidestepped William completely. He left the older man standing foolishly in the middle of the floor, with his hands suspended in midair. The sharp clicking of the executive's expensive Italian leather shoes against the faded burgundy carpet sounded like a ticking clock as he walked the entire length of the boardroom. He walked straight past Catherine, who shrank back into her seat. He walked past Preston, who looked as though he might physically be sick. He did not stop until he reached the head of the table. It is wonderful to see you, Cassidy, Marcus stated, his deep voice resonating with genuine warmth and immense respect. He leaned down and wrapped his arms around me in a familiar, friendly hug. I returned the embrace, a genuine smile finally breaking through my stoic facade. When we pulled away, Marcus did not walk to the other side of the table. Instead, David smoothly stood up and shifted one seat over, allowing Marcus to pull out the heavy leather chair directly to my right and sit down right beside me. The visual impact of the moment was absolutely devastating. I was sitting at the head of the table, backed by a ruthless legal mind, a brilliant financial auditor, and now a billionaire tech titan. William was left standing completely alone in the center of his own boardroom, his jaw hanging open in sheer disbelief. "What is going on?" William demanded, his voice cracking, darting his panicked gaze between Marcus and me. "Marcus, what are you doing? I brought you here to save my company." Marcus leaned comfortably back in his chair, adjusting his custom silk tie. He looked at William as if he were observing a particularly slow, uninteresting insect. "Let me clarify the reality of your situation," William Marcus said smoothly, his tone laced with chilling authority. "You did not secure a bailout from Omnitech. You blindly reached out to my acquisitions department, desperately begging for liquidity. My analysts flagged your pathetic plea and escalated it directly to my desk." William gripped the back of an empty chair, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to remain standing. Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Omnitech, the same Omnitech that just purchased your daughter's revolutionary logistics software for nearly $200 million. The same Omnitech that relies heavily on absolute corporate transparency and ethical leadership." Preston let out a sharp gasp, practically sliding out of his chair as the realization finally hit him. Catherine pressed both of her hands over her mouth, muffling a quiet sob of terror. Marcus let out a short, cold laugh that lacked any trace of actual humor. He stared directly into William's terrified, wide eyes. "William, did you really think I would bail out the guy who embezzled from my subsidiary without running it by my newest board member first?" William collapsed into his chair as if the bones in his legs had suddenly turned to dust. The heavy leather groaned under his dead weight, a pathetic sound that perfectly mirrored the complete destruction of his lifelong arrogance. The realization set in, instantly paralyzing him where he sat. There was absolutely no escape. He looked from Marcus to me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and darting wildly around the room as if searching for a hidden exit that did not exist. For decades, my father had operated under the delusion that he was the smartest man in any room, a master manipulator who could outmaneuver any obstacle with a few phone calls to his affluent country club associates. Now he was looking at the architect of his total ruin, and it was the daughter he had spent 30 years treating like an afterthought. I sat perfectly still, letting the deafening silence of the boardroom amplify his sheer terror. "You have nowhere left to run, William," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute unwavering authority. "Every single door you could possibly try to open has already been firmly deadbolted from the outside. I control the debt you owe to Vanguard Capital. I hold the secondary mortgages on the Fairfield estate. And thanks to Marcus and the expansive reach of Omnitech, I now dictate your standing within the entire global logistics network. You are financially, socially, and professionally radioactive. No bank will ever touch your name, no investor will ever return your phone calls, and no corporate entity will ever do business with a man who allowed his son to siphon millions of dollars from a primary client." Catherine sat perfectly rigid, her face drained of all color, looking like a shattered porcelain doll. The horrifying reality of her impending social exile was finally suffocating her. There would be no more charity galas, no more exclusive yacht club memberships, and no more bragging about her husband's legendary business empire. She was staring at the exact moment her curated artificial reality burned to ash. Sensing the absolute surrender in the room, David leaned forward. He smoothly slid a thick, precisely organized stack of transfer documents across the scratched mahogany table. The papers glided over the polished surface, coming to a dead stop directly in front of William. The stark black and white legal text represented the total forfeiture of the family's freight company, outlining the immediate transfer of every single asset, intellectual property right, and operational control directly to me. Preston stared at the documents, his breath hitching in his throat. The fragile remnants of his manufactured ego suddenly shattered, giving way to blind, irrational panic. He bolted upright, his chair crashing backward onto the burgundy carpet. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. "You are not getting away with this!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "You think you can just march in here and steal the company? I will burn it to the ground. First, I will go down to the basement right now and take a sledgehammer to every single physical server in this building. I will smash the hard drives until there is nothing left but plastic and sparks. You want the company records? You want the client ledgers? You want the proof of those offshore accounts? I will wipe out the entire network. There will be no company left for you to take over, and there will be no evidence left for the federal authorities to find." He was panting heavily, his chest heaving as he glared at me, clearly believing he had just discovered the ultimate leverage. He thought he could hold the entire corporate infrastructure hostage, willing to destroy our grandfather's legacy to save his pathetic skin. Simone did not flinch. She did not raise her voice, nor did she shift her impeccable posture. She simply looked at her soon-to-be ex-husband with an expression of absolute withering boredom. "You really are as incompetent as you are predictable," Preston, Simone stated smoothly, her calm tone completely neutralizing his hysterical outburst. "Do you honestly believe I would walk into a hostile takeover without securing the digital perimeter first? Go ahead. Go to the basement. Smash the physical servers to pieces. Take an axe to every computer monitor in this entire building. It will not make a single difference. 48 hours ago, I meticulously copied every single piece of data on this network. I backed up the entire company framework, the encrypted client databases, and the complete unedited offshore ledgers directly to Omnitech's secure impenetrable cloud servers." Preston froze, the color draining from his face as Simone methodically dismantled his final desperate threat. "The physical hardware sitting in this building is nothing more than useless, outdated metal." Simone continued, her voice slicing cleanly through his remaining bravado. "We have everything. You have nothing. You are completely powerless." Preston's knees buckled and he sank slowly back to the floor, burying his face in his hands as a pathetic whimper escaped his throat. He was utterly defeated, finally broken by the undeniable reality of his own staggering incompetence. I turned my attention back to William, who was staring blankly at the transfer documents resting on the table. The fight had completely drained out of him. He was a hollow shell of a man stripped of his power, reputation, and his leverage. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out my leather wallet. With slow, deliberate movements, I extracted a single crisp $1 bill. I held it up for a moment, letting the green paper catch the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom before placing it gently, precisely on top of the transfer contract. "I am not just taking it," I stated, locking eyes with my father. "I am buying it. The purchase price for this company, your entire legacy, is exactly $1. Sign it or the FBI is called in 5 minutes." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair. His presence completely neutralized William's final illusion of a rescue. My father stared down at the $1 bill resting on the transfer documents. The harsh fluorescent lights of the outdated boardroom seemed to spotlight Washington's face, mocking the arrogant entitlement my family had built their identity upon. I tapped the table, drawing William's terrified eyes back to mine. 5 minutes, I reminded him, my voice devoid of empathy. "The digital clock is ticking." William reached out for the gold fountain pen near his discarded legal pads. His hand trembled so violently the pen clattered loudly against the polished wood. For a man who had spent his adult life projecting corporate dominance, his ultimate defeat was pathetic to witness. He picked up the pen on his second attempt and stared at the signature line. This document stripped his title as Chief Executive Officer, dissolved his majority shareholder status, and transferred every voting right and physical asset directly into my name. A choked breath escaped his lips. Tears of humiliation spilled over and splashed onto the paper. He pressed the pen to the paper. The scratching sound filled the silence of the room. He signed away his life's work. William mechanically slid the folder across the table toward Catherine. My mother stared down at the legal documents as if they were covered in a lethal poison. Her rigid posture had completely collapsed. Signing this document meant giving up her honorary board seat, her company credit cards, and her primary source of funding for the charity galas she used to maintain her social standing. Catherine looked up at me, her eyes pleading for a last-minute reprieve, searching for the obedient daughter she used to manipulate with such practiced ease. She found nothing in my expression to comfort her. With a muffled sob that echoed in the quiet room, Catherine snatched the pen from her husband and scribbled her signature. Her tears fell freely now, ruining the last remnants of her makeup. She shoved the folder toward Preston with resentment. Preston stared blindly at the signature line. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He looked shattered, stripped of the manufactured confidence he had worn like a shield his entire life. "Pick up the pen," I commanded, leaving no room for debate. "Remember the night you cornered me at that diner 4 years ago?" I asked, watching his pale hand shake as he reached for the gold pen. "You shoved a grease-stained napkin across the table. You wrote an insulting contract on it demanding I surrender the initial patents for my software in exchange for $1. You told me my ideas were worthless and that I should be grateful you were willing to buy me out before I inevitably failed. You laughed and told me $1 was exactly what my future was worth." Preston kept his eyes glued to the table, swallowing hard as the memory visibly crushed him. I wanted this specific moment to carry a certain poetic justice. I continued, my voice laced with cold satisfaction. "I wanted you to understand exactly what it feels like to have your entire existence reduced to a single denomination. The difference between us is my software revolutionized global logistics and your incompetence bankrupted a family empire. Sign the paper." Preston squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear leaking from the corner, and hastily scribbled his name. The legal deed was finally done. It was total submission. David immediately reached across the wide table and pulled the folder back to our side. He efficiently scanned the 3 fresh signatures, cross-referencing them against the strict legal requirements. David gave me a single sharp nod of confirmation. The company was officially mine. I picked up the crisp $1 bill from the table. I held it lightly between my index and middle fingers, extending my arm to slide it across the smooth mahogany surface. The bill glided directly over to Preston, stopping right at the edge of his clenched fists. "Do not spend it all in one place," I stated, deliberately mirroring the exact arrogant phrase he had used on me 4 years ago. Catherine buried her face, openly weeping. William stared blankly at the far wall. Preston, however, slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket, desperately attempting to summon a final shred of his shattered ego. He looked at Simone, then at me, lifting his chin in a fragile display of defiance. "You took the company," Preston sneered, his voice shaking but laced with lingering venom. "You humiliated us. But I signed the deal. The debt is forgiven. The embezzlement files stay locked away. You took everything else, but at least I'm not going to jail." David paused, his hands resting lightly on the brass latches of his leather briefcase. He slowly looked up at Preston, an expression of profound pity crossing his sharp features. David pushed back the crisp cuff of his suit jacket and glanced deliberately at his expensive silver wristwatch. "About that," David said, his voice calm and methodical. "The contract you just signed explicitly forgives the corporate debt. It prevents Omnitech from pursuing criminal charges regarding the specific wire fraud against the company. However, it absolutely does not grant you any immunity for the systemic perjury you committed in civil court during your divorce proceedings with Simone." Preston froze instantly, the remaining blood completely draining from his pale face once again. "You swore under oath that you had no hidden assets," Simone added smoothly, her eyes gleaming with calculated satisfaction. "You deliberately lied to a federal judge about those offshore accounts to illegally hide money from me during the asset division. That is a completely separate federal crime, Preston." Before Preston could utter a single word of protest, the heavy frosted glass doors of the main corporate boardroom swung open. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a sharp, synchronized hiss, instantly chilling the stifling, desperate air inside the room. Two federal agents and a smartly dressed woman stepped over the threshold, moving with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that immediately paralyzed every single person at the mahogany table. The two men wore identical, sharply tailored dark suits, their posture strictly military, with gold shields clipped to their leather belts, catching the harsh fluorescent light. The woman leading them possessed an unyielding, clinical demeanor, her eyes scanning the room before locking onto her targets. She bypassed my catatonic father completely, walking directly toward where Preston was standing. "I am Sarah Jenkins, District Attorney for Suffolk County," the woman announced, her voice slicing cleanly through the stale boardroom air. She gestured to the two stern men flanking her. "These are Special Agents Miller and Hayes from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are here regarding multiple counts of perjury, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud in a federal court." Preston staggered backward, hitting his overturned leather chair with a loud clatter. He scrambled to stay upright, his hands trembling violently. He looked wildly at William, pleading for a bailout, but my father was completely unresponsive, staring blankly at the table. Preston then looked at David, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession like a suffocated fish on a dry dock. "You cannot do this!" Preston choked out, his voice cracking into a high pitch of absolute, unfiltered terror. "I just signed the transfer documents. The contract explicitly said the debt was forgiven. We had a binding deal. I just gave you the entire company." I leaned back in the mahogany chair that used to belong exclusively to my father, folding my hands together on the polished wood. "We did have a deal, Preston," I replied, my tone devoid of any lingering familial sympathy. "I promised to forgive the corporate debt. I absorbed the Vanguard Capital foreclosure, and I saved this entire manufacturing empire from total bankruptcy. I did that because there are over 400 innocent employees working in the warehouses downstairs who do not deserve to lose their livelihoods because of your staggering, selfish greed. I bought the company to save their jobs. The corporate ledger is officially wiped clean." However, I continued, my voice dropping to a colder, more dangerous register. "Forgiving a corporate loan does not erase the undeniable fact that you lied under oath during your divorce proceedings with Simone. You swore to a civil judge that you had 0 offshore assets. That is felony perjury. Furthermore, you attempted to extort me using a forged napkin contract to steal my intellectual property. Those are severe crimes against the court." David stepped forward, adjusting his suit jacket with practiced precision. As an officer of the court, David stated clinically, "I am legally obligated to report any direct evidence of perjury and fraud. Simone provided the unedited financial ledgers proving you hid millions in offshore accounts. Cassidy provided the forensic analysis of your forged napkin contract. I simply handed that verified evidence to the district attorney exactly 48 hours ago." Preston let out a guttural, pathetic noise. He backed into the wood-paneled wall, raising his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "You planned this from the very beginning," Catherine shrieked. My mother shot up from her chair. The poised, elegant country club matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, vicious woman cornered by her own actions. Her face was flushed red, the veins in her neck bulging prominently against her expensive pearl necklace. She slammed both hands onto the mahogany table, glaring at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "You set us up!" Catherine screamed, her voice echoing violently off the boardroom walls. "You came in here pretending to offer a generous buyout, but you just wanted to destroy your own brother and humiliate your father. You are a vindictive, heartless monster, Cassidy." The room fell dead silent. Even the federal agents paused, watching the explosive family dynamic unfold. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was second best. I looked at the mother who had watched her husband and son try to steal my life's work and who had smiled while they did it. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, liberating emptiness. I stood up from the head of the table, projecting the absolute confidence I had bled to build. "No, Mom," I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute finality. "I am not a monster. I am just a woman who finally learned how to protect herself. Catherine recoiled as if I had physically struck her. The venom drained from her face, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization of her own vulnerability. Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clinking sound was deafening in the quiet room. He spun Preston around and slammed him face first against the wood-paneled wall. Preston did not fight back. He simply sobbed a wet, miserable sound as the cold steel snapped securely around his wrists. "Preston Wilson, you are under arrest for perjury and fraud," Agent Hayes recited, his voice booming with procedural authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." While Preston was being read his Miranda rights, District Attorney Jenkins opened her thick leather briefcase. She pulled out a crisp white legal envelope and walked directly over to my mother. Catherine stared at the envelope, her manicured hands trembling violently. "Catherine Wilson Jenkins," stated, pressing the envelope against my mother's chest until she reflexively grasped it. "You are hereby served with a summons to appear in federal court. We have direct electronic evidence proving you knowingly aided Preston in hiding his assets during the divorce proceedings. You are facing charges for conspiracy to commit perjury. I highly suggest you secure independent legal counsel immediately." Catherine looked down at the summons, her mouth hanging open. The paper shook in her hands. The pristine, untouchable reputation she had worshipped her entire life was officially dead. She would be front-page news by morning. The country club would revoke her membership by noon. Agent Miller yanked Preston away from the wall. Preston stumbled, his head hanging low, crying openly, as the agents marched him forcefully toward the glass doors. Jenkins gestured sharply for Catherine to follow. My mother looked at me one last time, her eyes wide with undisguised terror, before turning and rushing after her son, her designer heels clicking frantically against the carpet. William had not moved a single inch. He remained standing by his empty chair in the center of the room. He did not look at his wife being served with federal papers. He did not look at his golden child being paraded out in steel handcuffs. He simply stared down at his right hand. Clutched tightly between his trembling, aged fingers was the crisp green $1 bill. It was the exact absolute total of his net worth. It was the complete, undeniable sum of his legacy. "Let us go, William," Marcus said, his voice dropping all pretense of respect. "Omnitech Security is waiting in the lobby to escort you off the premises." William slowly looked up. His eyes were hollow, completely devoid of the aggressive spark that had fueled his decades of tyranny. He looked at the massive mahogany table. He looked at Marcus, and finally he looked at me. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He slowly turned his back. His shoulders slumped in total defeat and shuffled heavily out of the glass doors. They were escorted out of the building they used to own, leaving me standing in the absolute silence of my new empire. The heavy glass doors closed, sealing the boardroom and marking the definitive end of the Wilson family dynasty. 6 months passed since that morning, a period defined by swift justice and absolute corporate restructuring. The fallout from the Federal Bureau of Investigation raid was instantaneous and brutally public. Preston's trial did not even make it to a jury. Faced with insurmountable digital evidence provided by Simone and the forged napkin contract retrieved by David, Preston's high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. He is currently serving a 3-year sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury. For a man who had spent his entire life expecting luxury and demanding deference, the stark reality of a concrete cell and a rigid daily schedule broke him completely. He lost his bespoke tailored suits, his collection of expensive European sports cars, and his artificially manufactured ego, leaving behind absolutely nothing but the undeniably harsh daily consequences of his own monumental arrogance. He now spends his days performing menial labor, answering to guards who do not care about his name. William and Catherine suffered a downfall that was arguably worse than a prison sentence. They were forced to endure a catastrophic social and financial exile. While my contract legally forgave the corporate debt, removing the Vanguard capital lien on the Fairfield estate, William's personal finances were entirely decimated. Stripped of his CEO salary, his company dividends, and his corporate expense accounts, the crushing reality of his lifestyle quickly caught up with him. To pay for Preston's exorbitant legal defense and Catherine's own criminal defense lawyers regarding the perjury conspiracy, William drained his retirement accounts. When that money vanished, they defaulted on the property taxes and the staggering maintenance costs of the Fairfield estate. The bank moved in precisely 3 months later. Today, the former titans of the country club reside in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their daily existence is sustained entirely by Social Security checks. There are no more charity galas, no more catered dinners, and no more fawning associates. Their former friends completely shunned them, changing directions in the grocery store aisles to avoid making eye contact. Catherine, who once viciously judged everyone by their exclusive zip code and imported designer labels, now spends her empty days staring at peeling, water-damaged wallpaper, trapped in a miserable personal hell of her own meticulous creation. William spends his time sitting in a cheap recliner holding the single $1 bill I left him, staring at it as a constant reminder of the empire he lost through his own toxic pride. In stark contrast to their absolute ruin, the logistics company experienced a monumental resurrection. I immediately absorbed the entire operation into my umbrella corporation, restructuring the outdated analog systems and integrating my proprietary software. The rebrand was seamless, but the true catalyst for the company's new profitability was its leadership. Simone did not just survive her marriage to Preston, she emerged from it as a corporate powerhouse. During the divorce proceedings, armed with the offshore ledgers she had brilliantly decrypted, Simone secured a devastatingly lucrative settlement. She stripped Preston of every hidden asset he had tried to conceal. I officially appointed her as the chief operating officer of the newly rebranded logistics firm. She commands a 7-figure salary, operates with fierce, unapologetic efficiency, and remains my most loyal executive. Simone bought herself a stunning modern townhouse overlooking the harbor, completely severing her ties to the suffocating traditions of her former in-laws. We transformed a dying, debt-ridden company into an industry leader in less than 2 financial quarters, proving that the business only needed to be freed from William's archaic grip. My own life shifted far away from the stale air of that burgundy-carpeted boardroom. I relocated my primary headquarters to Illinois, permanently distancing myself from the toxic geography of my childhood. The final chapter of this saga concluded on a crisp autumn evening, standing on the expansive wraparound balcony of my Chicago penthouse. The city skyline stretched out before me, a glittering ocean of glass, steel, and endless possibility. The freezing wind whipping off Lake Michigan was biting, but I barely felt the cold. The air tasted clean, sharp, and entirely free of the suffocating weight of my past. There was no more screaming, no more manipulative drama, and no more fighting for a seat at a table where I was never respected. There was just cold, hard, unshakable success. David confidently stepped out onto the sprawling balcony, the heavy glass door sliding shut quietly behind him to block the interior noise. He handed me a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. He wore a subtle, satisfied smile, looking out over the illuminated city. We had spent the afternoon finalizing the quarterly profit reports, confirming that the acquisition of William's former company had exceeded our most aggressive financial projections. The restructuring was complete, the legal battles were formally closed, and the opposition was permanently neutralized. David raised his glass, the golden liquid catching the reflection of the city lights. To seamless transitions and flawless execution, David toasted his voice, carrying the calm satisfaction of a lawyer who had just engineered the perfect victory. I turned to face the skyline, clinking my glass against his, with a sharp, clear ring that resonated in the cool night air. I took a slow sip, letting the chill of the champagne match the absolute clarity in my mind. I thought about the grease-stained napkin Preston had shoved across that diner table. I thought about my father's sneer when he called my software a worthless hobby. I thought about my mother's silent complicity. I looked down at the thriving, bustling city below, a world completely untouched by their petty, small-town arrogance. They all called my business worthless. I smiled, looking at the city lights. They were right. It was not worth anything. It was priceless.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.